I don't see anywhere in the teachings of Christ that we should parcel out and develop policies designed to protect the narrow percentage of kids who may one day sue us. I think Jesus expects us to care for all the children entrusted to us. Jesus said, if we didn't care for the least of these, he's going to send away on Judgment Day a lot of religious leaders. And because we have elevated the teachings of lawyers above the teachings of Christ, there may one day be a reckoning. We have a lot to account for in the church.
That when Jesus is asked about what does it mean to love neighbor and who is my neighbor, Jesus says, well, let me tell you a story about someone who was assaulted. Let me tell you a story about abuse. And let's use this example of this story about abuse to talk about what does it mean to love my neighbor? What does it mean to think about who is my neighbor and what does it mean to care for them? That is such a profound and telling reality when you think about it, that's what Jesus goes to.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to a Grace Live conversation. Today, we are talking about denominational reform, addressing systemic abuse in the church. We're really glad that you could join us today. A little bit about Grace. Grace stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, and really we work with a mission to help the broader church to better recognize, prevent, and respond to all forms of abuse. You can find out more about Grace at www.netgrace.org. We try and have these live webinars once a month. You can find previous webinars on our YouTube page, and it would be great if you wanted to check those out. Our next couple of events that are coming up are going to be really important because they'll be a part of our fall campaign, Interrupting the Pattern, as we really seek to empower and protect survivors and help interrupt the patterns of abuse that we see at times in the church. We've got an event coming up on October 3rd where the board and some of our staff will share really from their hearts the vision of helping the church to do a better job in this area. But for today, our focus is on addressing systemic abuse in the church and denominational reform. We have a couple of incredible guests with us today, Victor Vieth and Mike Sloan, two people that I consider some of the foremost experts in the field of abuse and the intersection of abuse and our faith communities. We are honored to have you both on, people that I respect and that I consider my friends. Do you want to give us just a little bit of an introduction to who you are?
Sure. I'm Victor Vieth. I'm Chief Program Officer for Educational Research at Zero Abuse Project. We are a nonprofit organization that works to address all forms of abuse. I primarily work under a federal grant providing training, technical assistance, publications to child abuse prosecutors. But we also have a number of faith-based initiatives. We work with Grace, Sacred Spaces, and others on an initiative called Keeping Faith, where we try to bring faith leaders and child protection leaders together and teach them how to work with one another in responding with excellence to cases of child maltreatment. We also engage in a number of publications and research relevant to the spiritual impact of trauma. So, been around for 35 years, and so good to be with you, Pete, and you, Mike, on this very important topic.
And I'm Mike Sloan. I'm the Director of Safeguarding at Grace. Of course, as Pete mentioned, at Grace, our very simple mission is to educate and empower churches to prevent and respond to abuse. So in our safeguarding work, we have a more comprehensive approach we take with churches and ministries, where we have training at various levels. We have policy review and development. and consultation on other issues relating to both prevention and response. And then we do a lot of standalone work with churches and ministries, standalone training, standalone policy review, standalone policy development. But the approach we take in every case is to really help churches and ministries understand the culture it takes to reinforce that is put in place often by leaders, but it has to go down to everyone within the organization. It takes all of us as a community to be prepared to be involved, to have strong prevention and response. My background is I was a pastor for 10 years. So I grew up in the church, prepared for pastoral ministry, had internships, had seminary training, and then overlapping with my time as a pastor over the last 12 years, I've spent consulting with churches, training churches, and helping develop more effective policies for churches. So glad to be with you today. Glad to talk about this very important topic.
Well, thank you both very much. Many of you will remember that over the summer, Guidepost issued a report of their investigation of the Executive Committee of the Southern Baptist Church. At that time, Grace issued a series of recommendations, 5 key recommendations for denominational reform, ways that denominations could really take the bull by the horns and could really start making progress, not so much to check off a checklist of actions so much as how do we actually create an environment that fosters the cultural change that needs to occur in order for our churches to truly be safe places where abuse is not tolerated, abuse is not covered up, but instead people are protected, whether that's a child or somebody else who is vulnerable. And so back at that time, we issued 5 recommendations. And today we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into each of those recommendations and to understand how they may play out in a church or in a denomination that is trying to bring about reform, trying to create the safe space that I think our churches really are intended to be, a place of healing and a place of safety. When we issued that statement, Victor and Mike, Victor played a huge role, primary role in crafting them. Mike played a significant role as well as we prepared those and got those sent out. Of those 5 recommendations, the first one that we listed as being essential for reform within the church, reform at a denominational level, is theological reform. Understanding how this actually relates to our theology and that reform begins in seminary. Victor and Mike, you both have done some extensive work with trying to develop seminary curriculum. And Victor, I know that your seminary curriculum that you've developed is taught in a couple of seminaries, and you actively participate in teaching those seminary courses. Can you help us understand and unpack a little bit, what do we mean by theological reform beginning in seminary?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start out. We know when children are sexually abused or otherwise violated, the vast majority of offenders incorporate a religious construct into the abuse of the child. Well, what's true of offenders is true of the church as a whole. The church often distorts theology to avoid making a mandated report or to avoid lifting up the survivor or holding an offender accountable. We see that dynamic in play in the SBC report and virtually all cases of child abuse within any denomination. So we saw in the SBC report these allegations of abuse come up to the hierarchy, and there's distorted theology of, oh, if we address this, if we make a report, it may increase our liability, or it may deter the spreading of the gospel, which is our primary mission. Well, What if we addressed this in seminary and said the spreading of the gospel depends in part on our ability to protect children from abuse? What if we took Jesus seriously in everything he said and did in his interactions with children? How different might the church be? Suddenly, child protection policies wouldn't be an afterthought or something we do to lower our insurance rate or to avoid a lawsuit. It would be something we do because this is important to God. We would do a better job of addressing the spiritual needs of survivors. More than half of survivors have profound spiritual questions. I prayed and I prayed and I prayed and I asked God to stop the abuse, but the abuse kept happening. So what does that say about God or me or both? They have profound questions, but oftentimes their pastors and other faith leaders are not trained to address these issues, and they don't know how to coordinate pastoral care with medical and mental health care. And the reason they don't know what to do is that we didn't train them at the seminary level. We did a study way back in 2014. We looked at the course catalogs of every accredited seminary in the United States. We could only find 3% that had any mention of child abuse, much less a standalone course. I went through a great seminary. I'm in pastoral care, and nobody knew about the ACE research or other basic trauma studies. Well, if we graduate pastors with ignorance, we shouldn't expect them to be excellent in responding to these cases. So it's a critical long-term reform if we are going to address the needs of survivors, and we're going to get a handle on child abuse scandals in the future.
Yeah, Mike, you've had some experience with training faith leaders, and what have been your observations around this area?
Well, right. So a lot of our work, in addition to proactive measures, is with my colleagues at Grace, including yourself, Pete, is responding to consultations where the reason they're reaching out is because they've had no formal training. The pastoral leaders are feel out of their depth. There is the real lack of, and so we're seeing the consequences of that. And of course, we have to. It's our privilege to help anyone who reaches out to us. But we also have to assess, okay, why is this happening? Why are so many not prepared? And let's go back upstream and address the root issue at the source. So we have to go back to the source of the problem. We have to address the reality. And what this means for denominational leaders is that denominational leaders, as Victor said, we have to make this a priority in line with the teaching of Jesus. We have to invest time, resources. Of course, there's so many areas denominational leaders can use their time and resources. There has to be a reframing of this as a fundamental critical issue for the church going forward. And even as there is more awareness and a growing awareness of the depth of the problem, and that these are systemic problems that need to be addressed in a very thorough, more systemic way, we still have a long way to go. And then I would just add, on a personal level, I mentioned my background at the start. I had internships. I had, for my ordination, my denomination required all sorts of things I had to go through, tests, exams, all sorts of things. I had a wonderful seminary like Victor, and there were rigorous academic courses. And yet in none of those was there any kind of formal training or information related to abuse, and that this is a primary responsibility of leaders in local churches to, in line with the teaching of Jesus, to promote a safe environment, that this is a place of safety, a place of respect, where we love our neighbor, and that includes children and vulnerable people. It includes everyone. And that's a fundamental priority of God. So there's a lot of work to be done, for sure. But that is absolutely in line with my own experience, that there is a real deficit of theological understanding of these issues, framing of these issues, and that needs to be addressed. We need to devote many more resources toward this issue.
Yeah, I think what you said is both so profound. I remember recently talking with a pastor, and we were talking about an abuse situation. And I asked the pastor, did your seminary address this at all? Did you learn anything in seminary that would help? And he just laughed, because it wasn't addressed at all. And how can we expect pastors to do well if we have not given them the information and the tools that they need? And you also highlight that it is so important that it's central. It's not an add-on. It's not an afterthought. It's not this elective that you can take like underwater basket weaving, right? This is because it is important, and it is central to who we are in Christ and central to the mission of the church. And so we need to equip pastors in this area. So as we engage in this theological reform, as we start helping pastors to learn right from the get-go about how important and essential this is, how centrally tied to our Christian faith, hopefully they'll understand more about the teachings of Christ related to abuse. But even as they understand more about the teachings of Christ related to abuse, they may also be dealing with other advice that they're getting. Advice from insurance companies, advice from attorneys. And I'm not saying that we need to ignore those, but we also need to recognize, and this was our second recommendation, we need to recognize that the teachings of Christ are paramount. The teachings of Christ take precedence over what an attorney or an insurance company says. If we say we are the church, if we say we are the body of Christ, we need to reflect that above all. And Mike, I know that you speak extensively on how we can elevate the teachings of Christ, how we can understand the teachings of Christ when it comes to abuse. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you've observed as you've talked with pastors and churches around the country on this?
Right. So one of the things I will say, and a simple confession for any Christian is the simple confession who Jesus is Lord. And that's what you're getting at, that the teachings of Jesus are paramount. I'll never forget, before I did a training one time at a church, pastor picked me up and was driving me to the church, and we were talking about this training and this work, and it was for a leadership training. And I said, we're going to talk about how in the Bible, there are so many ways that the Bible addresses abuse, and God speaks very powerfully about abuse, and even in the direct teaching of Jesus. And he just looked at me and said, really? And he had never had those categories, or this idea that the Bible addresses these matters. And just to give you a few ways, this is one of the primary things we do in training with both leaders and with congregations, is to help them understand, as Christians, we have so many resources within the Bible, within theology, to access and to use and put to use in the church for the sake of standing against abuse, putting in proactive, safe policies and practices. Literally hundreds of times throughout the whole Bible, God calls our attention to groups of vulnerable people that need protecting: the poor, the disabled, children, specifically orphans, widows, the sick, the afflicted, and on and on and on. And literally hundreds of times in every major part of the Bible. And just think about the teaching and the ministry of Jesus. How often was Jesus with someone who was poor, disabled, sick, an orphan, a widow, someone who is in a desperate situation? Jesus focused his time and attention in his ministry. Of course, the Christian faith, the gospel, is good news for anyone, and yet Jesus had a special focus on those who were vulnerable. And God calls us to be protective of those who are especially vulnerable to being hurt. There are direct statements throughout the Bible standing against oppression, abuse. Jesus talked about children and how he received children being a direct reflection of the respect and honor that we show to God. That is such a profound statement about the place of the vulnerable in God's thinking and its importance. Very famously, Jesus condemned those who would harm children in the famous passage in Matthew 18 when he talked about it would be better for someone to have a millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea than to hurt a child. Of course, Jesus also famously condemned the leaders who prayed wonderful prayers, like in Mark 12, and yet used that spiritual position to financially prey upon widows and steal their houses. And of course, that would be a form of financial abuse or exploitation and spiritual abuse because it's using the spiritual position those leaders held. Jesus talked about standing in the way when the wolf comes and protecting the vulnerable sheep in John 10, and condemned those who were like hired hands who did not stand in the way. And by the way, the context of those verses come from prophetic passages like Ezekiel 34 and Jeremiah 23, where leaders are abusing power. That's the exact context Jesus is speaking into with those very powerful words. In fact, Jesus talked about basic abuse dynamics. We all know the statement that Jesus said, beware of one who's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. That's basic abuse dynamics. That's what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about someone who's a part of the Christian community, who holds power and trust over someone who's more vulnerable. And how does someone like that get away and abuse power? Well, they have to hide what their true intentions are from the whole community. So there's a very calculated deception and manipulation of others within the community to hide their true intentions. And only a very select individuals get to see the reality of what they're actually about. So there's just a few, of course, representative examples, but the priority of Jesus is very clear. The priority of Jesus is people, people and protecting people, not institutions. It's not how can we lower our liability, or a risk management approach is not at all high on Jesus's list of priorities. I interact with church leaders, and some have said to me, well, sometimes our lawyers have said, well, don't put this in your policy, this protective practice, because if you put this in your policy, you know, training and these exact boundaries, some good boundaries and detail and boundaries, you actually have to follow through on this. And if you don't follow through, your liability exposure is greater. So just don't put so much in your policy in terms of protective practices. Well, again, what's our priority? What is going to lead to how we make decisions? If training and boundaries, good boundaries, actually protect people, if we document boundary violations to maybe recognize a pattern of boundary testing sooner, those things will help protect people. And yes, if we put them in policy, we need to follow them and follow through. But shouldn't that be our goal as Christians, to be people of integrity and put the time and attention toward this and work on the culture needed to follow through? Isn't that what Jesus would have us do? So, we have to have that kind of approach, I believe. And sometimes I want to, ask church leaders who say, well, we're not going to do this. Our lawyer said we need to not have this, or, whatever practice. And again, we can't tell anybody what to do. We're an outside organization. They have to take ownership of it. But sometimes I want to say, well, how are you going to explain this decision to Jesus? Jesus, who said, the fundamental ethic we're called to is to love your neighbor as yourself. And that includes children. That includes the disabled. That includes survivors. Sometimes I ask church leaders, well, if you were a child again in this situation, what would you want your church leaders to be doing? If I was a child again, what would I want my church leaders to be doing? Would we want them to be putting more time and attention to these types of practices? And usually the answer is yes. So there are important legal questions, and there are important legal obligations. But as Christians, we can never forget that the higher, more important obligation is our call to be, as Christians, to protect others, to love our neighbor as ourselves. So
yeah, it's something that really needs to distinguish us, and that's one of the reasons that it is from start to finish throughout Scripture. And yet how rarely we hear it as a topic of a sermon.
Right.
How rarely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Victor, you've done so much work on this. You even wrote a book.
um, Yeah, I did. And just to add on to what Mike said, I am an attorney. I was a prosecutor for a number of years. I think the legal profession is noble, and I think it's okay for churches to have lawyers and to seek out their advice. But the point Mike is making, that we tried to emphasize in the grace statement, is you must not allow the lawyers to push out Christ, because their focus is on what do I do to limit liability, and that advice often would force you to contradict the teachings of Jesus. For example, you saw in the SBC report, the lawyers were saying, well, if we take action, if we do things, that might create a certain standard of care. It might lead to liability somewhere down the road. Well, that flatly contradicts the teaching of the Good Samaritan. Jesus didn't say, oh, well, if you go across the road and help this suffering person, if you put them in an inn and begin to pay for their medical care and their food and the like, that may create a certain level of liability, because now you're assuming responsibility for the person. Jesus didn't say that. Jesus said, walk to the other side of the road where the suffering are, because God expects you to walk with the vulnerable and to lift them up however you can. So that's one example. But I've seen cases where lawyers say, well, don't apologize to the victims, because if you do, it'll be an admission of responsibility that you did something wrong. Well, again, that flatly contradicts the teachings of Jesus. If we've hurt somebody, if we've wronged somebody, we shouldn't worry about how that would play out in a lawsuit. We should reach out to the suffering and move toward repentance. In the area of policies that we'll talk about later, most churches don't have any policies. Even if they do, they tend to be policies only focused on preventing child sexual abuse. Why is that? It's because lawyers and insurance companies know the kids who get sexually abused in the church, those are the ones who may one day sue you. And so our policies have purposely left behind kids are being sexually abused in their own home, or kids are being beaten, or kids are being tortured, or children are witnessing domestic violence, or being emotionally abused or neglected. I don't see anywhere in the teachings of Christ that we should parcel out and develop policies designed to protect the narrow percentage of kids who may one day sue us. I think Jesus expects us to care for all the children entrusted to us. Jesus said, if we didn't care for the least of these, he's going to send away on Judgment Day a lot of religious leaders. And because we have elevated the teachings of lawyers above the teachings of Christ, there may one day be a reckoning. We have a lot to account for in the church.
Yeah.
And isn't it profound? And I'm so glad you brought up the example, Jesus's story about the Good Samaritan. Isn't it interesting that when Jesus is asked about what does it mean to love neighbor and who is my neighbor, Jesus says, well, let me tell you a story about someone who was assaulted. Let me tell you a story about abuse. And let's use this example of this story about abuse to talk about what does it mean to love my neighbor? What does it mean to think about who is my neighbor and what does it mean to care for them? That is such a profound and telling reality when you think about it, that's what Jesus goes to in that context, and we would do well to take note of that.
Yeah, and Pete, you mentioned my book. One of the points I made there, it's not just in the teachings of Christ that we should care for the vulnerable, particularly children. It's in the life of Christ. So in the Gospel of Matthew, we're told Jesus is the descendant of at least 3 sexually exploited women. So concern for the vulnerable arguably is in the DNA of Christ, the very blood of God. Jesus' own mother was subjected to disgrace because of the unusual nature of her pregnancy. Jesus himself was a near victim of child abuse, as Herod orders all the boys in Bethlehem below a certain age murdered. The entire church was founded in an act of child protection. Joseph and Mary and the wise men all acted to save the baby. None of us would be here today if it weren't for an act of child protection. And all the words and the teachings of Jesus that Mike referenced, not only are those radical by today's standards, but when Jesus uttered those words, it was perfectly lawful to beat a child. In fact, it was expected to beat them. There was a Roman Greco concept of logos. Children can't reason very well. It was perfectly okay to put a child on the side of the road where they might die from the elements or wild beasts, what we historians today call the foundlings. It was frowned upon in some communities to sexually assault a child, but it wasn't as bad as sexually abusing an older child. In the Roman Greco community, there were gymnasiums where men often wrestled naked with boys, and it turned into acts of pederasty. That was the world Jesus was born into, and so it was shockingly countercultural that he repeatedly referenced children. He literally said, as he put a child in the gathering crowd, this is it, this is the fault line. How you treat this child says what you really think about me, and what you think about me says what you think about God at the end of the day. So our treatment toward children, our policies and the like, really reflects whether or not we can truly call ourselves Christians.
This is the culture war that we really need to be involved in, to create a culture that no longer sanctions and accepts abuse of children and the vulnerable. Very profound. So we've got the idea of let's get this into our seminaries. Let's recognize the teachings of Christ, but we'll often need a path, a description of how to do that. And both of you have referenced policies along the way. And this brings us to our third recommendation, that child abuse policies are guided by child abuse experts and must address all forms of child maltreatment. And with that, we've also talked about the importance of addressing adult abuse as well, clergy sexual abuse and other forms of adult abuse, that policies must address that as well. I'm wondering if you guys could speak to that, but also one of the questions that's already come in is, how do you get a church to accept that they need a policy that actually addresses this when maybe they don't see it as a need? Mike, you do so much policy work. Do you want to start out the conversation about policy?
Sure. Because churches very often do reach out to us and say, hey, we would like you to review our policies and give us some guidance, or we know we need a policy, can you help us? Or we know we have this policy, but we need to develop further policies. So with that work, I think we have a fairly good finger on the pulse of where a lot of churches tend to be on policy. And so there are some good things being done in some churches, of course, and there is a lot more work to be done. Most policies that we come across that are in place in churches are very narrow policies, typically, in a lot of ways. They're narrow in that they are only about children, many of them. And when they relate to children or student ministry, often they're very narrowly focused. And sometimes even at the top of the policy, it says, this policy is for our staff and volunteers in our kids ministry programming. It's like, this is the context and this is where this policy applies. And very narrowly, it is designed by the church to be put in place within that structured ministry. That makes sense because a lot of churches have drawn on insurance companies and lawyers whose main focus, as we've said very often, is to think about risk management and liability concerns. So that's the area of greatest risk management and liability concern, is when the children are formally in the charge of the program of the volunteers and staff of the church. So it makes sense that that's where many churches would start with a policy. And yet what churches need to do is broaden, because having a policy that applies only for an hour of a Sunday school program on Sunday morning, or an hour of kids worship, or an hour or two of student ministry a week, that doesn't actually account for how most abuse occurs. And again, what is our priority? If the priority is actually preventing abuse and responding to abuse appropriately when it does occur, we have to broaden policy. Most abuse occurs in unstructured times and in homes. And we have to broaden policies to reframe policy on the community as a whole. And of course, church community doesn't just end after we finish Sunday service and all go home. Of course, any kind of Christian theology of discipleship and what does it mean to be a Christian and walk with God applies to how we're accountable at any time, and how we are thinking of protecting others at any time. So really, it comes down to reframing policy on the community as a whole, broadening policy to apply at any time, and having standards in place at any time. And leaders must take this on. You have to establish and work on cultivating an environment. You have to work on a culture that really supports everyone in the community playing their part. We need adults to notice if a boundary is being crossed in the hallway after church, or in the parking lot, or in a home, at the youth group event at a home. We need adults to have some training on recognizing common signs of abuse. So leaders can connect to our Christian faith, raise the education level of everyone in the community, clarify boundaries for everyone in the community. And often what's needed in policy is helping people overcome barriers to speaking up if there is something concerning that should be followed up upon. And so many in the church are concerned about, well, we want to think the best of everyone. We don't want to gossip, and we don't want to have a culture of suspicion. Okay, granted all those things. And yet what we're actually talking about is having a culture where it's a responsibility that all of us are speaking up if there are policy violations or boundaries being crossed. And are we responsibly responding to those? Do we have for example, we recommend having a team in place in a church setting that is men and women, and making it as easy as possible for people to come forward and articulate questions or concerns, and certainly any information related to policy violations. Those have to be putting something in place and just making it very concrete. If you see something that's concerning, if there is a concern, please follow up and talk to someone on our safety team, or talk to a leader about this. And leaders have to put the culture in place that we're responding, and we are reinforcing boundaries, because that's what many grooming offenders will do. For example, they'll test boundaries, they'll try to cross boundaries to see, is there an opportunity here? Is there a vulnerability here? If I cross this boundary, what is the child doing? Does anyone else notice? And so having a clear deterrent for that, and having strong protocols that we're responding to those boundary crossing situations is absolutely critical. In terms of what we recommend and what we are often advising churches on, is the main areas are, we have to start with this perspective we've been talking about, grounding this in our Christian faith. We should have clear definitions of abuse in different forms. We should have beyond child abuse definitions related to other forms of abuse that adults experience as well. We need to have a team approach. So like having designated leaders who will respond, whether we call that a separate team or not, that's up to the church. But having that in place to facilitate everyone in the church contributing if called upon, that's absolutely vital. Good policies will have screening practices in place for certainly employees and volunteers, and a few basic things for members. If you have formal membership, saying, well, part of being a member is that you're agreeing to follow our policy. We might do a few other minimal things as well, having training in place, and then boundaries that apply to everyone. Many churches reach out to us and they say, well, this guy in the foyer after church is interacting with this minor in a concerning way, but he's not on our staff, and he doesn't work with the volunteers. So is there anything we can't really do anything about that, right? Because he's not on our staff and he's not a volunteer. And we say, well, actually, of course you can do something about that. And it's very important that you do something about that. There should be boundaries that everyone is accountable to. For example, all touch should be welcomed by the other person. If it's within a power differential, like an adult and a child, or a pastor, even in an adult, there should be some accountability with any kind of touch. And certainly we need mechanisms for accountability as a part of policy, protocols to respond to boundary violations, protocols for reporting and other care for survivors, and addressing issues of safety and accountability. If we have any information related to abuse of power or an alleged abuse of power.
I
And
really like
certainly,
how you brought
yeah.
in that everyone has a responsibility and that it's part of the culture, that the
Yeah.
policies don't just stand alone. Victor, do you have anything to add
Y-
on the policy side?
Yeah, just really quickly, if it sounds complex, it's because it is, and that's why it's so important to bring in child abuse experts to help guide you through that process and that you can turn to when you're wondering how policy should fit in a given situation. Again, often faith communities rely on law firms and insurance companies, and their focus is on limiting liability. So the policies they often recommend are designed to prevent sexual abuse within the organization, again, because those are the children who may one day sue them. That's problematic for two reasons. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, it's leaving behind all the children who are physically abused, emotionally abused, neglected, and sexually abused in their own home. The second problem is, though, even if you sinfully only wanted to protect the kids who might sue you, you can't even do that unless you're prepared to protect kids from abuse in the home. Because we know from research and anecdotal evidence that kids are abused in the home, especially those in multiple ways. They have higher signs of trauma. Offenders are good at picking up on these red flags. They abuse the child all over again. So if we're going to cut off the supply of the easiest children to be violated, we're going to have to pay equal attention to abuse in the home. A good starting place is the book, The Child Safeguarding Policy Guide by Boz Chividjian and Shir Berkovich, who is the executive director of Sacred Spaces, and it'll help you walk through chapter by chapter how to build out your policies. And of course, the Child Safeguarding Initiative that Mike oversees is a great resource to guide you through that work as well.
Yeah, I love how you referenced it as, and if you're sinning by not putting the right focus on a godly focus on protecting kids, that helps us to remember. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to add into that because your initial question was what do you say to those who say, oh, we don't need policies? I would say faith without works is dead. And if
Mm.
we're unwilling to protect the children that God entrusted us, especially given the emphasis Jesus had on caring for children, then your faith may not be dead, but I would argue it's on life support.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's powerful. Often, even if we have these initial 3 steps in place, we struggle to figure out, what does that even look like on a day-to-day basis then? How do we live it out? And that is what brought us to our 4th recommendation, a way to understand how we can live it out on a daily basis. Yes, we take the teachings of Christ, but an organization called SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, has also done a lot of work on understanding trauma and something called trauma-informed care. And the recommendation is that all youth ministers and volunteers must meet some standards related to SAMHSA's trauma-informed care, their concept of trauma-informed care. I want to describe a little bit what that means. I've worked with organizations really across disciplines on understanding, what do we mean when we say trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed care? And it really breaks down very simply. 1, we try and understand what trauma is. And 2, we really take a look at how that understanding of trauma then impacts our treatment of people. And so we look at, how do we understand trauma? We often think of trauma as an event that occurs. We often think of trauma as somebody is assaulted, somebody is abused. But SAMHSA helps us understand that trauma is more than that, and they give us a concept called the 3 E's of trauma. That, yes, indeed, that event is a central piece of the trauma that a person has experienced, but there's more to it than that. It's how that event is experienced. Do you experience the event alone? Or do you experience the event surrounded by God's people? Do you experience the event blamed for your own abuse? Or do you experience the event loved and cared for as the person who was harmed, as the person who was wronged, as the person who was sinned against. So we've got the event itself, we've got how you experience that event, and then we have the ongoing effects of the event. Victor and I wrote an article called Wounded Souls that talks about the spiritual impact of abuse, the ongoing spiritual toll that takes. It's an ongoing effect of the abuse. Often there are ongoing physical health, mental health, ongoing financial implications. And these are all ongoing effects of that initial event. And so we start by understanding it's the event, but it's also how that event is experienced and the ongoing effects of the event. And this is so important to remember because, one, we have a responsibility to try and stop the event. But even if the event occurs, the church can play a significant role in how that event is experienced and the ongoing effects of the event. And that can be an incredible positive impact or an incredibly harmful, re-traumatizing impact. So we understand trauma in this light. And then as we interact with people day to day, we try and bring in 6 key principles: how we interact with survivors, how we interact with each other, and how we try and set up our ministry spaces, our churches. We look at safety. That might be physical safety, that might be psychological or emotional safety, it can be spiritual safety. Is it safe to question why God would allow such a thing to happen? So we start with safety, and then we move on to trustworthiness and transparency. Transparency is impacted by what information we share, how we share it, and when we share it. And then we've got this whole thing of trustworthiness. And so many times I've heard of faith leaders say, we've got to get people to trust us. We've got to get people to trust us. And I would say, that's not your goal. Your goal, your responsibility is not whether or not they trust you. Your goal is to act in a way that is worthy of trust, not because that's a strategy for getting someone to trust you, simply because that's what God said to do. And so you are to act in a way that is worthy of trust, whether or not that person actually does trust you. The third principle is peer support, that we understand that somebody who has experienced something similar to what this survivor has probably has more insight, and we need to equip survivors to support each other. That's not saying that if you haven't experienced abuse, you can't be involved in caring for a person who has. Yes, you absolutely can, but it's recognizing that the person who has experienced abuse probably has more firsthand knowledge of what it's like and what might really be needed to care for a person who has experienced abuse. Collaboration and mutuality, that we are working together with the survivor. We're not just doing for, not just doing to, but we're doing with the survivor. We're listening to what the survivor is saying. The survivors, again, are playing a key role in helping us understand, helping us move forward. That we are collaborating within our communities, that it's not just one pastor or one leader having all the responsibility, but that within our community, we are collaborating. And it's also recognizing the limits of our own expertise. So as a therapist, I'll reach out to a pastor and say, help me better understand some of the spiritual implications of this. And as a pastor, reach out to child protection, to law enforcement, to a therapist to better understand, because we reach outside of our own small competency areas. The fifth is empowerment, voice, and choice, that people are given some control of what's happening to them. Trauma strips power away. And one of our jobs is to walk alongside a person as they take some of that power back. And then the final principle is humility in the face of the historical, cultural, and gender factors that simply cannot be separated out from trauma. We only have so much time today, so we can't really dig deeper into those principles, into that understanding of trauma, but I would encourage you to check out Grace's YouTube page. We just completed a 6-part series where we looked at each of those principles and how they would apply in faith communities. So please check out those programs on our YouTube page. The 5th recommendation that we have really gets to that 4th principle: develop faith and child protection collaborations. Victor, you have been involved in some incredible groundbreaking work around implementing chaplaincy programs at children's advocacy centers and other work establishing these collaborations. Can you help us understand a bit more what these collaborations might look like?
Sure. There's a significant body of research that most maltreated children are impacted spiritually, and they often have profound spiritual questions. Am I still a virgin in God's eyes? Why didn't God intervene when I prayed? I'm angry with God for not protecting me. Does that mean that I have forfeited an ongoing relationship with God? My body had a biological reaction to the abuse, so does that mean I'm equally sinful, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, most children have no place to turn with these questions. Most mental health providers have no training on the spiritual impact of trauma, and they're often uncomfortable with inquiries such as this. And as we mentioned earlier, most faith leaders have no education on trauma-informed care. So one of the goals of the Keeping Faith Initiative is to get faith leaders in the same room and teach them how to work together. And as part of that, we have worked with accredited children's advocacy centers to implement chaplaincy programs. So you've got chaplains who meet rigorous board-certified standards for trauma-informed care. We give them additional training on the spiritual impact of trauma. And then when children raise these profound questions, there is a resource in the Children's Advocacy Center. And then the chaplain takes a leadership role in educating other faith leaders in their community, so that if they have to pass the baton, let's say the child is Catholic, they wouldn't make a referral to any old priest. They'd make a referral to someone who's trauma-informed and knows how to coordinate the spiritual care with the medical and mental health care at the Children's Advocacy Center. At least 6 Children's Advocacy Centers have implemented that reform. The first was in Greenville, South Carolina. Last year, over 500 children and or their families asked for the services of the chaplain, and there's research underway to document the efficacy of that model. So we think it is a promising practice, and we hope to continue to grow it.
That's great. Mike, any more thoughts on collaboration?
In our consulting work, there's often a need to remind churches that pastors that they have limited roles and they're not experts in as it's not that pastors can't do any kind of pastoral counseling or support. They can, but they need to respect the limits of that training and utilize and refer to licensed therapists and counselors when needed. And there's just all sorts of other roles that may be needed as we respond. For church leaders to have an awareness of common resources, local resources in their area, or even some national organizations that they can reach out to help a woman experiencing domestic violence to make a safety plan, or to ask a question of a therapist, or reach out to a child advocacy center. There's just a lot of different types of expertise and roles that are needed to respond well to the complexity of many situations, for pastors to have wisdom and develop some of those relationships, and with the humility to know that, hey, I don't have all the answers and I need to rely on others, and this is a community issue. We can look to others and develop those avenues to reach out and get support when needed, and connect families and survivors to resources.
Great. We've had a lot of great questions come in as we were having this discussion, and thank you, Mike and Victor, for the wisdom and the insight that you shared. I wish that we could get to the questions that we have. The questions that are on there are so important and so profound. I find it really eye-opening to see too that many of these questions are about how do we understand the historical, cultural, and gender factors associated with trauma, including questions around how would this apply in a different culture, whether it would be a Latino culture or whether it would be some other culture, and also just addressing how do we, if a faith community has opted to go with something other than a binary definition of gender, if the faith community has made a decision to have a non-binary definition of gender, how do we then address lock-ins and youth activities and retreats and things like that? And some of those questions are just really essential that we answer and that we look at. But given our lack of time and the fact that we're running out of time, I had to choose just one question. And so the question that I'm going to put to our panel is this. And if we're not getting to your question today, please know that you can email us that question, and that we would be happy to try and address that question via email. And you can email me at pete@netgrace.org, and we would try and address those questions in more detail. And again, I apologize that we're running out of time to get into them more in depth. But the question that I want us to look at and address that came in addition to putting policies in place, do you see child abuse awareness and prevention opportunities in sermons, Bible studies, premarital counseling, Sunday schools for children of all ages? How do we make it so it's not just about a policy, but it's just showing up all the time throughout our churches?
Yeah, Mike's the pastor, but I just want to quickly say it's throughout Scripture. So David and Bathsheba is an account of the sexual exploitation of a vulnerable woman. The rape of Tamar, she walks away weeping aloud. She is reflecting what trauma is and not addressing that. It mushrooms into multiple other sins. And Mike and I have already talked about Jesus's words in life are replete with lessons about child maltreatment, which again circles back to the original recommendation, which is seminary reform and required coursework. And part of that is how to write a sermon about child maltreatment and how to draw from the rich text that God has given us.
Yeah, and I would say to pastoral leaders, look, this is not about creating a new separate ministry about abuse. How do you normally talk about your ministry and your priorities? How do you know, what structures do you have in place to teach people, disciple people? What structures do you currently have in place to communicate your priorities and how we are to live and walk with God and with one another? It's about integrating this priority into the things you're already doing. And you do that already as church leaders in every which way possible. You know how to do that. It's not about creating this new separate thing. It's about integrating as you preach, as you teach, as you have Bible studies, as you have membership classes, as you have prayers for the youth trip, as you have a service of lament, to pray for survivors, to talk about the laments of the Bible and how God understands the feeling that we would have to feel powerless, to feel confused, to feel like God is distant, and to acknowledge that and talk about that. It has to become your voice as leaders speaking into that to help everyone understand and accept this reality. So you just have to keep it at the forefront in ways that make sense in your context, in your community. And the last thing I'll say, Pete, is, if you have a marathon meeting, a training day and go over your policy one time a year, and that's all that, if that's the only time people hear you talk about this issue, when you start your ministry calendar year and we have a kickoff and we have a training and talk about our policy, if no one else hears you talk about the vulnerable, the abused, the teachings of Jesus, caring for others, being ready to respond if a child starts to talk about something uncomfortable, the need to speak up if there's a concern. If those things aren't mentioned throughout the ministry year, you're not going to have the culture needed for effective prevention and response.
Yeah, finding ways to just have it always be a part of the conversation. Here in Minnesota, we have an organization called Care in Action Minnesota, which works to establish partnerships between the child protection workers and faith communities in like an adopt a social worker program to help meet the needs of kids and families in the child protection system. And every time a need comes in, now the whole congregation starts talking about, oh yeah, remember, child abuse is a thing. Oh yeah, what are we doing to help our broader community? Oh yeah, how are we creating safe environments? How can we support kids and families? Care in Action is modeled off of a similar program in Charleston, South Carolina called HALOS, Helping and Lending Outreach Supports. And so one way, just a practical way, is find out if there is a program like that in your community, in your area. If there's not, can you talk to your church leadership about starting such a program? And it keeps the idea of child abuse at the forefront as we're revisiting this all the time. We have to wrap up. We could go on and on. We could have at least a 2 or a 3 hour conversation about this. Thank you everyone for joining us today and for participating in this discussion. Thank you for being passionate about this and for reflecting, I think, the heart of God when it comes to caring for and protecting kids, caring for and protecting those who are vulnerable. If you, again, had a question, we weren't able to get to it today, please do send me an email. Zane put up my email earlier, pete@netgrace.org, and we'll try and respond to that. Thank you also to Mike and Victor for joining us today, sharing your wisdom and your insight. It's been, I think, a very powerful time. I hope everyone has a good rest of your day. Bye.